Hey guys, a lot of new people are playing Fallout 2 these days, probably because of the TV show, and I thought I'd take some time to do a quick guide of how to create or properly create a character to get started. So first off, when you start the game, you are offered a choice of 3 presets. Essentially, one of them is a fighter, one of them is a more a pacifist guy, and one is a thief. And they all suck, so don't use them. There's no benefit to using any of them. Just create your own character, which is more fun anyway. And it brings you to this screen. The first thing you should do is click this. It doesn't seem to be a button, but actually it is. And this is how you set your name, which I didn't notice at first. And you can also change your age and your gender. Age has no effect in game at all, but the gender does. Essentially, male characters get a handful of choices and one tiny bit of an ending, and female characters tend to be taken advantage of and can sell their bodies in game a couple of times. Otherwise, not much changes. And then we get to the more technical part. You have statistics, which are like endurance, strength, and so on, so kind of classic. And Fallout system is called Special, because S-P-E-C-I-A-L. You have character points which you can spend on your characteristics. Then you get to pick up to 2 traits, and you have to pick or tag 3 skills. The rest is just derived data and computed based on what you chose. Regarding the stats, strength is almost a dumb stat, except for a few builds. The reason for that is not that it's bad, it's just that you can raise it in game by quite a lot. So even starting at 4, you can end up with a max value in game once you get to the late game. So there's not much reason to raise it beyond that, unless you want to play a melee character, which I do not recommend, especially for a first playthrough or for newcomers. You want to be far from people because you can die very easily. Next up, perception is kind of a middle ground stat. It's kinda good, but not as good as the rest. So essentially, whatever points you have left, you're going to put into perception. You don't want it too low, especially for ranged characters, otherwise you can't aim at all. But also, a few quests require you to have 5, 6, 7 perception to notice stuff that will open up new dialogue options. Next is endurance. It's basically just your health point, hit points. You want it kinda high, but again, it's not as good as the rest, so you generally keep it 4, 5, 6. More is not beneficial, and less is just too few. Charisma, in Fallout 2, it's basically the dumb stat of choice. It brings almost nothing. The only benefit, the only noticeable benefit is that for every 2 points of charisma, you can have 1 more companion. But unlike Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and so on, companions in this game can die, will die. So you generally don't want to rely on them. You want to keep it at 2 to be able to recruit them once. Maybe do a couple of quests, but that's it. Intelligence is absolutely critical. You want it very high, because for every point of intelligence, you get 2 additional skill points at every level. Just so you know, by the time you finish the game, you should be around level 20 or so. You can go much higher. You can go to infinity actually, because there's enough random encounter and respawning encounters that you can farm it if you want. There's no need to, but you can. So each intelligence point is about 40 skill points by late game. Most people are going to recommend setting it to 9 or 10, and I completely agree with that. You really want a high intelligence character for most regular playthroughs. If you put 3 or lower, you basically change the game entirely. Every single line of dialogue, or almost every single line of dialogue, will change to reflect that your character cannot speak, or speak well, cannot think well, and so on. So you are locked out of many quests, but you also unlock a few other quests or backdoor quests. It's interesting to do, but it's not something you want to do to start with. It's just a complete clusterfuck. Agility is not how dexterous your character is, it's how many action points you have per turn. Fallout 2 is completely turn-based, and you want a lot of action points because this is how much stuff you can do during your turn. Starting at 10 may be a bit excessive, but it's completely valid. You can raise it a couple in-game through perks. And if you have already played the game, or if you have played Fallout 1 and you know what kind of weapon you want to target, take that into account. For instance, if your weapon takes 5 action points to use, it's extremely good to have it at 10 because it's a new breakpoint. You can shoot twice in a turn, whereas having it at 9 would have not that many benefits. If you don't know, just put it to 10. It's a very, very, very safe choice. And last is luck, which is a very controversial stat. Some people love it, some people don't. Personally, I kind of love it. But at no point does the game make it very, very clear what luck is used for or how exactly it's going to impact your playthrough. So do as you feel. You can notice that you don't have enough points to, well, basically raise everything you want, but one of the traits is gifted. Gifted takes away from your skill points a bit, but gives you 1 additional point to every stat. It's almost broken. It's extremely good. And what you lose there, you can largely compensate by having a 10 int, which will add it back as you level up. And also a lot of skills you're never going to use anyway, so taking a hit on them is not a big deal at all. If it's your first playthrough and you want to have a, let's say, a good time, start with gifted. Don't think about it at all. Just do it. And start with 10 in, 10 agility. The rest you can put wherever you feel like it. Something like this is a very solid start, in my opinion. Then about traits, so you can only choose up to 2, and one of them most likely going to be gifted. And there's not too many good choices for the rest. This is basically trash, 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 kind of trash, trash, trash. Fast shot is very good late game. It prevents you from doing aimed shot, but it lets you shoot more. And by the time you reach very late game, most of your shots are going to be critical hits anyway, so you don't need to aim that much. But in my opinion, it's best to not start with fast shot, start with literally anything else. And if you reach this level of late game where fast shot is something you want, just mutate something you have into fast shot. It's something that you can do through a perk, and it's just much more efficient for the early game. Bloody Mess is purely graphical, as far as I know. It just makes people explode. There's almost no interest in doing that. It's something you will do through crits anyway, sooner or later. And a few of the violent ways to die are very annoying in the base game, because people are essentially disintegrated and all the items drop on the ground and you have to pick them up one by one, which is quite annoying. Jinx, again, just my opinion, but Jinx, in my opinion, is one of the very, very, very best traits, maybe even better than Gifted, or that close at least, for combat-oriented characters. It will turn every fail into a critical fail, both for you and for the enemies. But the thing is, if you are playing the game tactically, you are going to be far from enemies, you are going to be with a character which can aim extremely well, much, much better than your enemies can. So you should critical fail about 2.5% of the time, while your enemies will fail and critical fail 25 or 50% of the time. It will disable a third or half of the enemies. And once in a blue moon, yes, it will blow up in your head, but it's still a very, very good thing to pick. And if you're playing a pacifist, it's even better, because Jinx only applied to combat stats. And if you're a pacifist, you are never going to be jinxed at all, ever. Good natured is quite good as well. Maybe not as good as the other choices, but still quite good. It will bump a lot of useful stats at the cost of a lot of fighting stats, but basically you will only ever use one of these six. Which one depends on your playthrough, your character, but you don't need to know 10 fighting styles, you just need to be very good at one of them and use that one constantly. So taking minus 10% on every other is insignificant. Chem reliant, chem resistant, they're mostly flavor. You can pick them, but they won't change much. Sex appeal, mostly for roleplay, opens up a handful of quest lines, but very, very minimal stuff. And skilled adds a few skill points per level, but you can only take a perk every 4 level instead of every 3 level. And you really, really, really want perks every 3 level. You do not want to be skilled. So pick whichever one you want, but if none of them appeal to you, still pick one, even if it's one with no effect, just because this way you can mutate it into fast shot or into something else later. And last, the skills. So the way it works is you can tag up to 3 skills, and if a skill is tagged, when you spend a point on it during leveling, instead of gaining 1%, you will gain 2%. That's it. You also gain a starting bonus of 20% to them. And for the most part, it has no other effect except for speech, which you should tag, by the way. I'll get back to it, because one of the very, very early quests check that speech is tagged and not just that speech is at a high value. Small gun is basically all the firearms we see commonly, so pistols, rifles, and so on. It's by far the most common type of weapons, especially early game, where it's the only type of ranged weapon you can find. If you are starting off, it's by far the best choice for combat options, by far. So do tag it, and raise it very, very high, meaning about 120 to 130%. Yes, skills can go higher than 100%. They can go as high as 300% actually. And most of them will have a point where they stop being beneficial. Like for small guns, once you reach 130 or so, you will hit 95% of the time, which is the hard max. So get it there, stop it there. Big guns are somewhat more damaging than small guns, but you don't find many of them. You don't find any of them early game, and you won't find ammo for most of them until mid to late game, especially in sufficient quantity. So if you are starting off, do not tag big gun, do not use big gun, you just won't have the possibility to do it. And it's the same with energy weapons. It's not that they are bad, it's just that they are not present in sufficient quantity for you to use them early on. And by late game, there's a very small difference between big gun energy weapons and small guns in terms of damage and damage output and capacity and so on. So you can stick to small guns up until the very, very late game. It's not an issue at all. There is one, maybe two very good big guns, and maybe one very good energy weapons, because late game enemies tend to have energy resistant armors. Unarmed and melee weapons, I would recommend you don't tag them, you don't put any points in them ever. First, because if you are in melee range, you're about to die most of the time. And second, because there are quite a few dialogue paths and quests very early game that will raise it up to 80 or 90%. So if you start with a high value, you don't gain any benefit from those paths. Throwing is complete trash. You may want to use it to throw grenades, but unless you have a high value into it, odds are you will blow your own face, which is kind of bad. And except for one specific grenade type, there's just not enough quantity and damage coming out to make it worth using. First aid and doctor are very, very similar skill. They both heal you when you use them, and they both have the exact same limitation, which is you can only use them a set number of times until you have to actually sleep and rest, or at least wait for the next day. And since resting raises your health hit points passively, these skills bring extremely few benefits. Each time you use first aid, you do gain 25 XP, which early on can let you gain a small edge in leveling, but very marginal, and there's no cost to retrying. Worst case is you fail, some time elapses, and you can try first aid again, so even with 1%, you would end up healing yourself. You also find books that raises your first aid up to 90% in game. So really there's no incentive whatsoever to tag it or to put points in it. Doctor, on the other hand, even though it works mechanically the exact same as first aid, except you gain more XP but fewer uses per day, Doctor is a very good skill to tag and even raise to a high level, because there are quite a few dialogues with doctors or with computers that requires a high doctor check. So even raising it to 100 or 120, even though it's not a priority, by late game it's something you may want to consider doing, especially if you are aware of which stuff it unlocks. Sneak is honestly quite bad. I've almost never used it. First, because there are very few opportunities to sneak, both for combat and quests. And second, because you kind of can sneak cheese the game by entering combat mode, spending your turn, so basically 10 moves, and then ending combat mode without attacking anyone. Most of the time it will let you sneak through a door or sneak through a window or something like this, without needing the skill itself. Lockpick is extremely good. There are a lot of locks. It's almost never mandatory, but especially to get started, it will let you access quite a few areas and quite a few items much more easily than you would otherwise be. So if you don't know what to tag, Lockpick, very safe choice. Steel, well, the picture speaks for itself. Steel is very, 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 very bad unless you intend to scum reload. But even if you had 95% chance to steal, sooner or later you will mess up, and you don't want an entire city turned against you. So don't use steal unless it's really mandatory for some specific purpose, in which case you want either a lot of reloads or a very, very high value. Traps is something you want at around 40 to 50%. By the way, my values are very low because I'm on high difficulty setting. If you play on easy, you will have much, much higher values from the start. You want it at 40 to 50 because it's sufficient to find and eventually unlock most traps on the ground. And by mid-game, late game, you may want to raise it even further to 70, 80% for a couple of quests. But that's it, it's quite situational. Science is very good, surprisingly. Obviously not early game, but by mid-late game there are quite a few stuff which are gapped, blocked behind the science check, especially most interactions with computers and a couple of scientists will want you to have 100, 120, 130 science. It's something you will use your points into by late game because everything else of value will be capped anyway. Repair, not very important, and you can raise it through books in game. You may want to put some points into it, and it has some uses, but really it's not critical ever. Speech is by far and unquestionably the best skill in the game. You want it tagged from the beginning of the game, you want it raised from the beginning of the game. As soon as you can get it to 70 or 80%, this is your priority. Perhaps even more than any fighting skill, because almost all quests and everything you want to do or want to properly do can be done and should be done through speech checks. So you really want a high value there from the start, and by late game you want a very high value there. So start with 70, 80% and fairly quickly reach 120 or so. Barter, it's complete trash. It's probably the least useful skill of all. It just gives you better bartering price with NPCs, and that's it. And it's trash for two reasons. First, you can get infinite money just by eventually killing enough people and stealing their shit. I'm not talking about citizen, I'm talking about random encounters on the world map with no impact whatsoever to anything. So you will get rich eventually. And also there is gambling, which lets you gamble for money, as the name indicates. And the thing is, as soon as you reach 70 or 80% gambling, you start winning consistently. If you are at 100 or 110% gambling or so, you don't just overall win, you win fast. You can just keep a button pressed and your money will go through the roof. You can become a millionaire in a few minutes of just keeping a button pressed. So there's absolutely no incentive ever to use bartering. And last, outdoorsman. It's a very difficult skill to evaluate. It's supposed to give you a chance to avoid random encounters on the world map. And random encounters are the number one source of death, because a lot of time you will start surrounded. And if it's not even your turn to start playing, you are very likely to start dead before you can play. So you go from walking on the world map to dead with no input whatsoever. On the other hand, you can also just reload to avoid this happening, and you can get a lot of boosts to this skill in-game. So if you can survive the early game, it becomes complete trash by mid-game. You can raise it through skill books, which you find or buy in-game to infinite capacity. And also you will unlock a car, and as soon as you have the car, the skill itself is essentially completely useless. So to sum up, start with speech. If you want a very, very easy game starting from mid-game, tag gambling, put it to 80% or so, and you can buy your way out of a lot of quests and into a lot of very good items. Otherwise, for a more regular playthrough, start with small guns and start with Doctor, Lockpick, or Science. These are the best three, I would say, and Outdoorsman as an alternative candidate for a starting point. And that's it. You have your character. Make sure you review it, make sure you like it, and so on. But this will get you through the kind of noob area. And a lot of questions I get or comments I get about this is, but if I make a diplomatic character, blah, 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 I can't get through the ants, I can't get through the Scorpios, I can't get through the Stumble. Just so you know, yes, fighting them is a viable option, and the game leads you to believe it's the only option. So you can try to fight your way through. You can even get to level 2 by the time you end this area. But you don't need at all to work through this. You can just run along the edge, and that's it. You don't need to fight anything ever. If you go into a fight, you can still rush the door. It's not a big deal at all. You just walk through the door and close the door. It's a bit difficult to find where it is, but you can close the door. And after a turn or two, the ant or the scorpion or whatever will realize that it can't open doors, and the fight will end. So you don't need to fight at all. You don't need to use any fighting skill at all until you're out of there and until you can gain access to actual weapons much, much later. And the only exception to that is a guy by the end of the temple. I'm not going to walk through there, but there is one guy which will talk to you, which is actually a pretty decent fighter himself. But if you have tagged the speech skill, you can just convince him to let you pass. And the entire temple and the entire noob area can be done without any fighting whatsoever. So that's it. This concludes the getting started with Fallout 2 character creation and so on. I hope you liked it, and good luck.